You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by historian Martin Bruegel, author of Food History, A Feast of the Senses in Europe. He's here to explore a tradition that may seem like an oddity to some outsiders, and moreover, that may surprise people in terms of just how recent an addition to the French cultural landscape it truly is. La pause déj. All right, and welcome, Martin, to the podcast. Martin, can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do here in Paris?
Yeah, hi to everybody, and hi, Emily. Well, I am a historian at the National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food, and the Environment. And I basically work on long-term issues in food consumption, our food baskets, and their relation often to health.
That must be really fascinating work. And I think, I as an American, but I think often expats look at the French and the French food system as sort of this bastion of perfection. I'm sure that you've encountered many places in which that's not necessarily the case. And I'm sure we're going to get into some of that today. But you are here to discuss a word that maybe some non-French speakers haven't heard this phrase before, pause déj. So it's short for pause déjeuner. But I think we all have an idea of what the concept of the French lunch hour or lunch break is. As expats or as foreigners, we look at France and we think that everybody kind of goes off and does whatever they want for an hour or 2 hours, and they drink and they have a 4-course meal, and it's idyllic and wonderful, and we're very, very jealous.
And people fall in love.
Exactly. And I think that might be your story, right?
Yes, but I asked my wife, and she remembers it a little differently.
Oh, yeah?
So, but never mind. The idea about the pause déjeuner is really, that you sit down with people to a full meal, often consisting of 3 courses, the appetizer, the entree, and the dessert. Now, during work days, it's usually cut short by one of the endpoints. Either you don't take an appetizer or you take coffee but no dessert. That is the pause déjeuner. We know that about 60% of the French sit down to such a meal during the workday. The others have either different work schedules or go home to eat. And so, yes, it is a routine that is still quite well respected and followed in France, as opposed to, for example, the United Kingdom or the United States, where barely 20% of the people eat lunch with others from between noon and 2 p.m. So there is a huge difference. It also, lunch here lasts for most people about an hour. It's a little less, it seems, recently, but that is about a good description of la pause déjeuner.
Okay. And 60% of people, wow, that's a huge portion of the population.
The workforce, actually.
Of the workforce, of course, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think there is some legislative protection of, the possibility of taking a lunch break. Is that right?
Yes. It has actually more to do with hygiene at work than with the lunch break per se, but it so happens to define the lunch break by kind of an omission. And that is an interesting story, I think, that you're alluding to, because by mid-February 2021, the French woke up to discover that they actually had obeyed a law whose existence they did not even know about. That law stipulated that workers and employees had to leave and ventilate the workplace during their noon break, and it specifically prohibited eating near the workbench, the desk, in short, in front of the computer. And how did they learn about the existence of this law? Well, the government had just suspended that regulation in order to fight the transmission of the COVID virus in collective eating places like restaurants and canteens. It was meant to prevent the formation, really, of crowds in which people were unable to wear masks because, well, really, they were eating, eating and drinking. And as I just said, most of the people do this in France. And so they discovered that law, which some among the people who learned about it, especially commentators on radio and the television, but even in newspapers, thought the law to be a sign of the overregulation of the French economy. They thought it was a concession to workers and employees, a bit like the 35-hour working week or the 5 weeks of vacation. So some went so far as to suggest that the suspension, the temporary suspension, which was limited to the time of the epidemic, should be carried over into abrogation. And these pundits most notably said that regulation acted as a brake on the French economic performance, even though most people went out to lunch without the knowledge of the law being on the books altogether. So, well, anyway, that's where I came in, and that's why I thought it was important as a historian to set the record straight. And I discovered actually very interesting things. But the commentators first misconstrued the origins of the law, which was in fact paradoxically rooted in hygienic imperatives. By the end of the 19th century, you may kind of remember from your history lessons, scientists had pretty much proven that the incidence of the polluted atmosphere at work, where people evolved in smoke and dust and where they handled toxins like mercury, plum, or even arsenic, could be reduced if a rigorous ventilation carried off germs and lowered germs and microparticles and lowered the temperature in the work site. And of course, that's where practical considerations came in. The best time to aerate, to ventilate, was lunchtime. And so the 1893 law on hygiene and security at work mandated the evacuation and the ventilation of shops, factories, and offices at lunch. Now, if I can just round that out, interestingly, the workers and the employees were not all that happy about the law. They were accustomed to eat next to where they worked and found it either cumbersome or even expensive to eat in the streets or in restaurants. And actually, one of the first strikes of the seamstresses in Paris in 1901 turned around the right to eat in their shop, as long as the quality of the air was correct. They understood the hygienic considerations, but they thought the comfort, convenience primed these more sanitary considerations. So that is the origin of the law. These are the legal origins of the protection of lunch in France, and the law traveled or sailed through the 20th century pretty much unchanged until 2008, when it was actually reinforced because office work and the germs on our computer keyboards received a special mention. So you see, it is a long-lasting law that regulates eating at noon.
Yeah, and that's still something rooted in the law that's rooted in cleanliness at the end of the day, rather than in, what we would assume, I think, which is, getting a break. That's not the point of the law.
No, that is actually absolutely the origin resided in concern for workers and employees' health. The break is a positive externality, as economists would say. It's an unforeseen but good consequence of the law, because it creates the space where to get a break, where to turn off your mind or turn your mind to other things than your work, and to interact simply with other people, to resource yourself.
Now, when you mentioned this seamstresses strike regarding the price of going out to lunch, obviously going out to lunch is going to be probably more expensive than bringing your own. But in France and in Paris specifically, there are a lot of options for getting a less expensive lunch. There are lots of lunchtime prefix menus that you kind of alluded to, with this idea of having an appetizer and a main, or a main and a dessert for a fixed price. Bakeries will often do like a deal with a sandwich and a dessert and a drink. And then some places, some companies also offset the cost of lunch, either by having an on-site canteen or by offering people sort of meal tickets that you pay half of the face value and you can use them to buy food. Do you perceive those as ways to encourage people to sort of go out and buy their lunch, to go and socialize with their colleagues? I mean, how do you kind of situate all of those economic offsetting for the price of lunch?
Actually, you gave a very precise and complete description of the options that are there. It's true, there are canteens in firms that have more than 50 employees. You can go out to restaurants, or you can simply sit on a park bench if you want to eat alone or just with another person. Some firms have a special room called a refectory, where the salaried personnel can heat their lunch pails or simply sit down to break bread alone or in a group again. And it's true that the interesting fact here is that lunch is often subsidized. The ticket restaurant that you alluded to, which help reduce the nominal price of a meal. So yes, they bring down the cost of lunch to about, I would say, €7 a meal. You can also use them in supermarkets or in bakeries to buy foodstuffs or sandwiches. It does not pay for alcohol or non-food items, but allows you to carry your food basket home, for example, if you want to. You can use these tickets to buy food for your family.
And you mentioned something, alcohol, which I think we always think about the French sitting down to their, Wednesday afternoon lunch and having a glass or two of wine and then going back to work. Is that stereotype a reality in your mind? Do the French actually drink at their work time lunch hour?
Personally, I think that practice has lost much of its importance for health reasons, for example, and also for price reasons. It's not cheap to have a glass of wine with your lunch. So I don't think that it's common to have a bottle of wine on your bill at lunch. When I was starting as a researcher, my very older colleagues on the threshold of going into retirement were still drinking their glass or more of wine at lunch, especially on Fridays. That was the let it all hang out and were drinking. But the younger researchers in the 90s were not drinking at that time, except on very special occasions. And that's no longer the case, I think.
And that's not the only evolution that we're seeing in terms of the French lunch hour right now. So, for example, I know that, maybe a generation ago, and still sometimes in the French countryside, people would actually go home for lunch rather than take a lunch break at work and go to a restaurant. They could even go get their kids from school and take them home and have a family lunch together. And I think most children in schools get 2 hours off for lunch, whether they go home or not. Is that something that you're seeing disappearing? Families coming together and having lunch at home?
I think that's exactly as you described. There is a rural-urban divide. In the countryside and maybe smaller cities, people can go home and have lunch because the break is an hour and a half long. In cities, and especially in Paris, Marseille, or Lyon, people do eat out. The family meal for them is long gone during the working week, whereas it may persist in the countryside and in smaller cities. It is also so that, of course, school meals are sometimes a very good means to feed children from poorer families so that they can get a more balanced diet. And so families leave their kids at school in order to provide a complete meal for them.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, The Heart of You, where expert Annette talks manifesting, tarot, and so much more. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
So I think a school meal will persist, and family meal probably too, but in specific circumstances.
Well, especially because the school meals for French children, having gone to school in both the United States and France, I can say the French kids get 4 courses. They get appetizer, main, cheese, dessert. It's,
Yes.
It's tasty, it's balanced, like you said. So it's not, hot dogs and...
Is that what you're getting in the United States?
Yeah, when I was in the US, I think ketchup was still a vegetable. It was considered a vegetable.
Oh, okay.
So it's the French school dinners were pretty amazing in comparison. One other thing that I noticed coming into France from abroad is that the French do tend to sit down for their lunch. You don't see a ton of people running around eating something on the go. And actually, when I first came here as a student, I had someone stop me as I was eating a sandwich walking between 2 classes in the city, saying that I should sit down and enjoy it. And also, I've noticed that, lunchtime does seem pretty fixed between noon and 2. You don't see a lot of people eating like an early lunch at 11:30, and you don't really see people finally getting around to eating lunch at 3 p.m. And one of my favorite examples of this is literally if you're taking like a TGV, like a high-speed train that goes through the lunch hour, almost bang on at noon, every French person takes their packed lunch or goes to the dining car, and they all kind of sit and have their lunch at noon or 12:30. Do you see, is there a culture or perception if you saw one of your colleagues finally pulling a sandwich out of their bag at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, would that seem strange to you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is, if you look at the distribution of the meals during the day, you can see that breakfast is taken between 7 and 9, lunch between noon and 2, and dinner stretches out between 7 p.m. and quite a bit later. That may go farther into the night. But yes, these are fixed times where people at noon and dinner sit down. That is almost a rule. I remember that it was considered inappropriate to be eating standing at the desk or a table in a fast food 30 years ago. That may have been changing a little bit because there is a lively takeout sector, though even there people can sit down to tables and eat their whatever, kebab with their drink in a more comfortable atmosphere. Eating in the streets while walking, or walking between classes and eating a sandwich is something that is considered a kind of blasphemous type of behavior, really. I think that is still true today, maybe a little less than a generation ago. But yes, there is a strong adherence to the rhythms of eating. And time use surveys indicate that the meal times and the extent of the meals are pretty stable over time. Whereas in other countries, meal times get shorter and people tend to eat, just as you described it, on the run, on the go, and so on.
Well, I definitely know that in my interactions with American tourists in France, for example, they always ask me, oh, why are all the restaurants always closed? And I'm like, they're not closed always. They're closed outside of normal mealtime. So if you went to the Louvre in the morning and you don't get out until 3 and you're trying to find lunch, it's going to be harder than if you were trying to find lunch an hour ago, because everybody expects that you're going to be eating between noon and 2.
Though the French have also developed some economic acumen, and they adapt to their clientele. Mm-hmm. So when Americans descend on Paris and go to the Louvre and go to the Musée d'Orsay, I do think that the restaurants around those places offer lunch for quite late into the afternoon. So you can sit down and have a meal even at 2 or 2:30. Because it's economically profitable for the restaurants.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
But what I see and what I consider a development that is a little worrisome is that people do sit down for regular meals, but it may happen that they grab a bite to eat in between meals, which was also considered something you should not do for a very long time. And that, I think, the kind of snacking may be a little bit on the rise, helped by the food industry, which kind of suggests that you might have a little something to eat to keep your energy up and so on, which is, as you know, not good for your waistline.
Absolutely. And I think, there's that sort of mystifying, everybody's obsessed with how French people, and specifically French women, stay so slim when there's all this pastry and cheese. And I've always said to people, I think it's because the French sit down to eat. They don't drink caloric beverages except for alcohol and like maybe milk in their morning coffee, and they don't snack. And I think that waiting until your meal and eating until you're sated and not eating between meals is a huge part of why, the French are able to have those indulgences without necessarily, taking all the consequences of croissants and cheeses and pastries and things like that.
Yes, I believe that is actually true.
Yeah. Do you see any, aside from the cleanliness factor, do you see any benefits of having a true break, a true lunch hour that sort of everybody culturally adheres to in the society?
Yes, and that was actually the surprise of my research, which I had an intuition, but I actually didn't know. There are colleagues, social scientists, who have done research into the effects of lunch breaks on workers, people's well-being and health, and they pretty much came up with short-term consequences and long-term consequences. And so in the short run, it is clear now that the downtime at lunch, the break that you give your brain, the time you allow it to reoxygenize, so to speak, keeps or regenerates your capacity to be creative and productive in the afternoon. There is a clear factor between or relation between the lunch break and your economic performance in the afternoon. And incidentally, it seems also in more physical jobs, the incidence of accidents at work decreases when you have taken a break at lunch. So in the short run, there are two main consequences that are important, and which, by the way, the people who criticized the lunch break law, the ventilation and so on, completely overlooked. And in the long run, it seems to me that moving during lunch break, if only to walk to the restaurant or your canteen, helps with the prevention of physical wear and tear. Your body remains healthier. You do not have to go, for example, to the physical therapist to treat your backache or so. As we said before, a full meal or a good meal, a proper meal at lunch is something of a rampart against the temptation to snack in the afternoon. And so it helps really to keep your weight in line or down. And otherwise, in the long run, I've seen research that supports the fact that lunch breaks lessen the likelihood of burnouts, which is, of course, one of the big issues in the economy today. But to me, kind of the most important thing is really to share a meal. And there too, research seems to show that people who eat together are happier. The sociability, the kind of conviviality that goes on around the table at lunch keeps them happier, not merely healthier. So you could probably say the two go together. So while I kind of am myself quite flexible about taking lunch, I think the economy benefits from a lunch break, and I would regret if the law would disappear from the books, even though I think that the habit, the adherence, as you said, to the custom would probably persist now.
And you alluded at the beginning of our conversation to another sort of personal link you have to the lunch hour and why it's so special. I know you said your wife doesn't remember things exactly the way that you do, but can you tell me that story?
Well, it's. I remember having invited her for lunch after having seen her at where I worked, and she remembers inviting me to coffee to get to know each other after having seen each other for quite a while. So I remember having been sitting down with some other people and her, and she says, "No, no, no, we were two, and we were drinking coffee late in the afternoon." Whatever. And that's when we started to appreciate each other. So now you have the two versions, and we'll never quite know which one is the correct one. But both turn really around consumption, which is interesting. It's not on a walk, not on a hike, not on a bump in a train or so on.
Amazing. Well, it's a good reason to make sure that we maintain the lunch hour in France.
And elsewhere, actually.
And elsewhere, exactly. Well, Martin, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I just have one last question for you before I let you go, and that is, what is your favorite French word?
Anticonstitutionnel.
So unconstitutional,
Yes.
and I think it's one of the longest words in French, right?
Absolutely. That's why it came to my mind.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I hope that the French lunch hour is never unconstitutional in France. And I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
Thank you. So long.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.